Alright, so this is gonna be episode one of the new VGC series I'm doing on this channel entitled the Exposé VGC. And first episode is gonna be about the type chart. Alright. So been on pretty pretty short hiatus uh since I finished the Exposé series for TCG. And yeah, I was just very busy. So just doing a lot of restructuring and planning for the next VGC series that I'm going to be doing. Right. So yep. So I'm going to do about a few episodes for the series, and yeah, the series. Right. So um, honestly, I want to kind of explain sort of why I'm doing a series like this for VGC. Um, but honestly, I feel like the series will just speak for itself. Honestly, and honestly, uh, there's not really a way that you can really prepare yourself for this series. To be honest, so even if I really explain why I wanted to do a VGC series like this, it honestly wouldn't even do the series justice. So I think I'm just gonna deliver it, and people can make of it what they want. All right, so yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. All right, so this is gonna be a very boring series, to say the least. We're not gonna be getting into anything, in depth. This is just gonna be basically introductory VGC. Basically, is the best way to put it. All right, so yeah, so if you want to be listening to music or something, or be watching something while you're listening to this or something like that, that's probably highly advised because this is not gonna be a very exciting series. I can tell you that much. So at least these first two episodes. All right, so yeah, just giving you a warning about yeah the theme of this video, or series rather. All right, so yeah, so Pokemon, right? You're aware, has 18 types, right? So there's 18 types that Pokemon categorized into, right? So go to the Marcus function, Scarlet Violet, you can pick them up, pull them up, and you can pick up the types. Right, so these are the 18 types that you have, right? I'm not gonna name them out loud. Read them if you like. But if you play Pokemon, you're pretty familiar with Pokemon, you should know them by heart. So yeah. So um these types can be categorized into three main categories, right? And so I've illustrated this in what I call the type chart. So we're gonna take a look at it, right? So type chart is basically a chart that depicts sort of the three categories types can be categorized into, and basically kind of uh, the characteristics of the types, right? So Pokemon is an RPG, right? And so RPGs usually have these type of class uh distinctions, right? And then subclasses within classes, right? Um So yeah, just pick your favorite RPG. You know what I'm talking about, right? So um, Pokemon is no different, right? It's just the difference between Pokemon and then your traditional RPG that you play is that part Pokemon is trying to also compete as well, right? So what you get, right, is basically you get this much more uh obscure type chart, right? That seems to matter less because you're computing, right? And actually, yeah, but that's just because there's not a lot of battle RPGs to really reference, right? When it comes to a type chart, so when it comes to Pokemon, it seems to matter less because Pokemon, right? Aside from having the play Pokemon program and all that, I seem to uh, attain major success. Despite being a pretty obscure competitive game, right? But yeah, Pokemon is no different in terms of its type chart, and also the other thing that we need to also consider when we think about Pokemon's type chart is that basically Pokemon is Japanese game, right? And so being a Japanese game, right? Um, let me just pull something up here. Being a Japanese game, and go full screen from here. Anyways, I want to be able to draw on it and have a full screen, but it's fine. So being a Japanese game, yeah, can't draw on it. But Pokemon's a Japanese game, right? So just do your best to kind of visualize this. I don't have a way to draw on it and keep it full screen, but fine. So Pokemon's a Japanese game. So being a Japanese game, right? The average Japanese player would probably be able to understand, right? Kind of Pokemon's, RPG aspect, right? Without having to, have something like, what you have pictured here, right? Um, so, there's a lot of things that, you're familiar with Japanese culture, right? Or whatever, however you keep up with Japanese culture, right? That the Japanese have a lot of practices and customs that are quite different than than we do in Canada, for example, or United States, right? And these things also have Japanese terms that go along with them, basically, right? And it's the same thing with the RPG side of Pokemon, right? Pokemon um has I guess Pokemon, right? Obviously, all these things have different names in Japanese than they do in English, right? And so it's probably pretty easy for a Japanese player who's pretty good at Pokemon, right, to be able to figure out, this is this and this is that, right? So yeah, just that. Of course, since Pokemon is a Japanese game, we don't really have the English equivalent of what the Japanese people probably have. And this is what I'm basically trying to do here. Is I'm trying to illustrate what the Japanese have in English, right? Hence the type chart, right? So if you're aware of RPGs, you're pretty aware that RPGs fall under three classes, right? You have generally they would be called, and I'll try to just illustrate this here. I'll just sort of try to illustrate this here so that this is much easier to understand. So let me just zoom in here. No, can't. Either way, um, oh, don't crop. How big it is. All right, just bear with me a bit here. Just want to pick this really well, so it doesn't go over a lot of people's heads. You know. Just do this. Okay. All right. It's a bit small, but anyways, right? So RPGs generally fall under three categories, right? RPG classes, right? So you have your combat class, right? And generally in these like JRPGs, if you want to understand this better, you probably classify this as like your warrior or something like that, right? Right? Just 2 R's. This would be like your warrior, right? Then you'd have uh your like support class, right? And it'll probably be like classified as like a mage, right? Then you have basically their, faction, right? That's generally how you'd look at it, right? So that would generally be like the JRPG, tactical RPG, whatever the adventure RPG, whatever it is, right? That'd be the way that you would illustrate, your generally three main classes, right? And then of course you have your subclasses, right? So in this case, the class, that covers all the covered classes is, or the main class for combat would be fire, right? In this case, then the main class for your faction class would be water. And then your main class for your mage class would be grass, all right? Hence, why you get fire, water, and grass, you know, as your starters, right? So that's like the best way to really understand it, right? But in this case, this is more of a battle RPG, right? So it's trying to be a competitive game, right? So in this case, you're not going to have very thematic classes, right? The classes are going to matter more in terms of their roles, right? Hence, role playing game, right? And so as a result, it's not going to be as cut and dry as something like, for example, you know, uh, a Tails game, right? So that's why it just seems so kind of hard to really put these guys in the categories. It's just because, as opposed to it being very thematic, it's trying to be very much more role oriented, right? So yeah, right? So yeah, that's why you get these classes first as your first options, right? It's just so that because they're the main classes for each of these three classes, right? So I illustrate, your warrior class as combat, right? I illustrate the faction class as balance, and then I illustrate the mage class as sorcery, right? These are just generally more broad terms, right, and also are more accurate to Pokemon's themes as well than something like warrior or faction or thing, right? Because Pokemon's really trying to be a very much more slice of life game, right, than your traditional RPG that is trying to be a very either a very good timepiece, right, or very much more thematic, right? So yeah, right. So so combat, of course, would imply like these are like your which would be like your fighters, right? Right. These are the guys that are gonna make your opponent basically uh defend, right? Right. So these are the guys that'll make your opponent, you know, fight, right? Like this is what makes your opponent fight, basically, right? And I'll just illustrate that there, right? Then you have your sorcerer class, right? And these are obviously like your mages, and these are the classes that make your right. So this would be like your like generally, if you want to put it in a JRPG term, right? Your support class, of course. But these are generally the classes that are gonna make your opponent think, right? And then you have your balance class, right? This is your factions, and generally, in RPGs, right, your factions are, you know, uh, your tribe, right, whatever it may be, right, and this is just the class that gives your. This is just the class that is the. If you want to put it in a more easy to understand term, it would be like the flavor. I don't know if you're Canadian or American, but this is how we spell flavor in Canada. So, all right. So this is your flavor, basically. If you want to understand it, kind of, in a very broad term, right? So yeah, you want to understand kind of what these classes do. That's the best way to understand it, right? Right. So for the combat classes, we have uh, rock, ice, ground, poison, and fighting. Right. So generally, and this is gonna get more into like understanding actually Pokemon by itself, right? So this is gonna be I'm gonna use a lot of Pokemon analogies here. So if you're familiar with rock and ice types, you understand that these are types that hit a lot of Pokemon super effectively, right? So for example, rock, right? I'm gonna use a different color marker here. So let's use orange, right? So rock, right? Remember, rock hits ice, it's flying, fire, it's bug, right? And then the only types that it resists, that resist it, right? So I'll use blue. The only types that resist it are steel and fighting and ground. Other than that, it hits every single type for either neutral damage or super effective damage. Right, so you can see that this classification here, right, hard to mitigate, right? You understand kind of what that means, right? So generally, it would just be classified by high damage, right, and again, right, high damage, and then yeah, right. So that's the hard to mitigate tag, right? Ice, the exact same thing, right? So ice, right? It's ground, dragon, lion, right, and grass, right? It only gets resisted by fire, water, steel, and yeah, right? And the rest it hits either neutral, and the rest it hits neutral, right? So again, right, same thing. You understand why it would be classified as hard to mitigate, right? High damage, right? So rock and ice, of course, yeah, would fall under the same category in terms of their, you want to call it damage profile, right? All right. That's essentially what we're trying to illustrate here is the damage profile, right? So damage profile by that I mean, basically the throughout the range of attacks in the type in, kind of, and also based on what the types hit, how would you classify, their types of damage, right? So ground, the damage profile we have here is low damage modifier, right? And in this case, ground moves, ground moves, moves like high horsepower, pumping tantrum, earth power, right? Scorching sands, earthquake, right? These are moves that, generally they have decent base power, right? But like besides that, the Pokemon that get them don't really probably usually don't have that very high attack. And then like if it's same type attack bonus, right, or stab, and they're also the moves don't really have as good of a matchup spread than like rock and ice, right? So for example, ground, right, hits fire super effectively, it's poison, steel, it's electric, right? And then it's immune. Flying is immune to it, right? And then bug resistant, grass resistant, and yeah, right? So as opposed to something like rock and ice, right, where nothing is immune to it, ground it hits, it's four types super effectively, but it's resistant to bug, right, and grass, right, which we'll get into why that's pretty significant. And then there's a type that's just completely immune to it, right? So it's a much easier type to handle as opposed to something like rock and ice, right? So that's why I classify it as low damage modifier. That and the fact that generally these moves are not going to really have a lot of punch behind them, besides just either being super effective or being stabbed, right? So then we have poison, right? And once we get through this, it's gonna be pretty easy to rush through sorcery, and then we'll have a big explanation for water. But yeah. So poison, right? Classified as low maintenance, right? Poison moves generally all pretty much the only way that they really get any punch behind them is if they have some sort of secondary effect that lets you poison the opponent as well, right? So generally, again, these moves are very easy to use, right? They have very low drawback, and then right their secondary effects are generally pretty weak, right? So that's why you classify them as low maintenance, right? And just for the sake of time, I won't get into its type matchups, but yeah, just understand poison Pokemon, generally just poison, right? So that's basically um what makes them low maintenance, right? Then you have fighting, right? So fighting that classify as high maintenance, right? And these are because fight moves are very hard to pull off, right? And this also has to do with its type matchups as well, right? So fighting Pokemon are they hit steel, they hit dark, they hit rock and ice, right? Super effectively. Then they're resisted they're immune to ghosts, right? Right. Then they're resisted by poison, flying, bug, fairy, right, and psychic, right. So you can see very readily, and they also hit normal super effective too, right. You can see very readily that you know they hit a lot of types super effectively, right, but they're also resisted by a lot of types, right, and then they also have an immunity to ghosts, right. So this makes them very hard to pull off, right? Just through looking at the type chart, right? Then you also, if familiar with fighting moves like close combat, focus punch, right, dynamic punch, right. These are moves that have a lot of drawbacks to them, right. So although they're very powerful when they're pulled off, they either have a lot of drawback or they're just very hard to set up in general, right? Because generally fighting Pokemon, their types, their stats vary a lot, right? So you're not gonna get a very high attack fighting Pokemon, and then it's just gonna have really powerful fighting moves, right? You're gonna have to probably do some sort of setup, moves like bulk up, right, and storage dance, etc., to be able to get the fighting Pokemon off the ground. And so that's why they're classified, you know, as high maintenance, right? Just setup, right? All right. So now you have sorcery class, which is like the you know the dark to combat light, right? So these are like your opposites if you want to look at them that way, right? And you can see that they have the same damage profiles as the combat, right? Except these are just different types, right? So again, right? Remember, you can just rewind. You remember these sorcery are like the types that make you think. These are the types that make you fight, right? So as opposed to these types that are just trying, as opposed to combat, which is just trying to make you, um, basically defend, right, or also be on the offensive, so you can take them out. These guys are trying to basically set up the board for these guys, right? So again, same type profiles, right? Psychic and Ghost have the same type of profiles as Recognized, right? Psychic, of course, would fall under the category, same category as Rock, right? Well, actually, I haven't already got into that, but I'll get into it now, right? So Psychic and Rock would fall under like your like stronger category in terms of the hard to mitigate, right? So you want to put it like that, right? Psychic stronger than Ghost, right? You want to put it like that, but again, right? Psychic, right? Uh, hits fighting super effectively, poison, and resisted by, well, it's immune to dark. Dark is immune to it, and it's only resisted by psychic, steel, right? That's pretty good, right? Only two resistances and one immunity, right? And if you remember in Generation One, there was no steel and dark, right? So the only thing that psychic was resistant to was psychic, right? So you can see that psychic would fall under the same category as rock in terms of like being the more powerful of the hard to mitigate types, right? Right? Then ghost would fall under that same category, right? Hard to mitigate. In this case, ghost, it's psychic. Pretty sure that's it. And it hits itself super effectively. Yeah. Then it has an immunity to normal, Normal immune to it. Then resisted by dark, and that's it, right? So has only one thing is resistant to, but only hits two things super effectively, right? So, right, but that's just the type matchup, right? Not too important, right? We're trying to get into a sort of the roles that these guys would play, right? This is what's more important, right, than the damage they do, right? Because for combat, right, it's just damage, right? Just damage, and might. You want to put it like that, and then for sorcery, it's more control and setup. You want to put it that way, right? All right. So you visualize psychic types. You visualize moves like psychic terrain, trick room, future sight, uh, you know, trick, power trick, power swap, power split, guard split. All these moves that have a very very powerful effect, right? And also there are also moves that these type of Pokemon get, psychic Pokemon get. So you also have to consider, do these Pokemon have these moves, right? Hence, the thinking aspect of the sorcery class, right? Ghost, right? So of course, right, psychic would fall under the category of more control, right? Right. So that's psychic. Then when you think of ghost, you think of moves like spite, confuse ray, curse, moves like that, right? Moves that are pretty, disruptive, right? So ghost would be more for disrupting, right? You want to look at it that way, right? So those are hard to mitigate for the sorcery class, right? Then we have fairy, right? So fairy will fall under the same damage profile as ground, low damage modifier, right? You have moves like Moonblast, Play Rough, Dazzling Gleam, right? Those are generally the moves that you get for fairy Pokemon, right? So these moves, they have high base power, right? But then they generally just don't have a lot of punch behind them, right? So hence the low damage modifier, right? But in fairy's case, fairy, um, as opposed to ground, right? Where ground is trying to hit like some of these types that we haven't really covered yet, but as opposed to just trying to hit certain types, fairy moves are generally also moves that are very, supportive, right? You have moves like charm, right? You know, um, lovely kiss, which I don't even think is in Gen 9, um, mystic terrain, etc. Right? So as opposed to ground, right? Fairy is more of your like or actually, it would be better to say it as your enchant, right? Right. So then, bug, same category as same type profile as poison, right? But in this case, these moves, can get pretty annoying, right? You have moves like, infestation, right? Sticky web, uh, struggle bug, right? Very easy to use moves, right? But generally, their effects are not that meaningful. If you want to put it that way. So these moves would fall under the category of just like annoying moves, right? You want to look at it like that, right? And it's very ironic because the type is bug, right? So when someone is bugging you, right, they're annoying you, right? And then you have dark. Dark from the same dark profile as fighting, right? But in this case, you have moves like snatch, which was a move from a previous generation, right? You have moves like uh, torment, crunch, right? Knockoff, right? These are moves that require a lot of investment, right? These are moves that you're gonna invest into a lot, right? To really try to get a lot of value out of them, right? Taunt, moves like taunt, right? Dark pulse, right? These are moves that generally, as opposed to fighting, right, where they require a lot of setup to do a lot of damage. In this case, they require a lot of foresight, right? So these are moves that are more like more planning moves, right? Right. So they are also under the category of high maintenance as well, because again, right, obviously as opposed to fighting where you're just trying to do a lot of damage, in this case, dark moves cover a way bigger scope, right? So it's not just only about something like just doing a lot of damage, right? So yeah, that's the sorcery class, right? Then we'll get into the balance class, right, or the faction class, right? So the main type is water, right? And essentially, what these classes are basically just the flavor that the Pokemon get if they have this type, right? So very excuse me, excuse me, very straightforward, right? So dragon, you got like unpredictable Pokemon, right? So when you think of dragon Pokemon, you always think of Pokemon that have a lot of attack and a lot of special attack, or a lot of defense, or a lot of special defense, right? So it's very hard to really figure out, the uh, stat profile of the Pokemon, right? Not only that, Dragon Pokemon also learn a lot of moves, right? So you don't know what the type sets for the Dragon Pokemon are going to be, right? So that's where you get unpredictable, right? Electric, right? Uh, not only that for Dragon Pokemon, they only hit themselves super effectively, right? And then they have an immunity berry, right? And then they're resisted by steel, right? So again, right? It's also just very hard to just figure out how much damage these Pokemon are going to do to you as well, because for the most part, you're probably going to just get hit by them neutrally, right? So again, falls more into the unpredictable theme of them, right? Electric Pokemon, right, would be more disruptive, right? these Pokemon, right? You're just mono electric, right? The only Pokemon that hit you super effectively are uh this is super effective that hit them ground, right? Only ground hits you super effectively, right? And then Pokemon that you resist, right? You resist flying and grass, right? And you resist steel, right? Other than that, everything hits you neutrally, right? So it's very easy to set up an electric Pokemon to take very specific types of damage, right? Because they have a very good resistance profile, right? So it only gets hit by ground Pokemon super effectively. So this is like your great, leveler, right? If you want to look at it like that, right? Electric is like your leveler, right? Right? Then you have Steel, right? And then it falls under the category of Vanguard, right? Vanguard is just like a military term for like the people that go in the front of like fighting force, right? So again, right, Steel, you're pretty familiar. Obviously, going to take forever, right, to write out Steel's type profile because if you're familiar with Pokemon, Steel resists a lot, right, and it doesn't really hit that much super effectively, right? So just very easy to understand them as a Vanguard type, and very easy to understand that if you want to compare these last three types, Steel would definitely be the easy category, right? If you want to understand it, right? And obviously, easy doesn't mean best, right? Or easiest to cheese with or whatever. No, it just means that it's easiest to understand, right? And it's also easy to ease you into the game as well, right? So yeah, if you're familiar with battle RPGs, you're very familiar with the fact that there's always this class that's like for beginners, and essentially, if you want to use that analogy, Steel would be that class, right? So then you have normal, right? Normal is just vanilla, right? Hence the name normal, right? And if you want to use last three types, it would be like the medium type, right? Not too hard, but it's not too easy, right? Normal can do a lot of things, right? And also normal is another thing about normal is that it has nothing to hit super effectively, right? So yeah, that's just the way they balance it, right? Then you have flying, right? And then flying would be categorized as like opportunistic. As a result, it would be like a difficult class, right? So again, we already covered this. Ground Pokemon can't hit flying Pokemon, right? And then they're resisted by grass, bug, fighting, right? So and then they get hit super effectively by electric, rock, ice, right? So very hard type to dispatch, right? And it's just generally a type that is going to be used, right, to give yourself a very good board, right? Hence opportunistic, right? So those are your types, right? So again, right, these guys have their classes, right? And if you're familiar with Pokemon, you have all these type combinations, right? So if you took uh, a type in from the balance category, and then you took a type in from the sorcery category. You put them together. So, for example, if you had a water grass Pokemon, then you'd get a balanced sorcery Pokemon, right? You took two type ins from balance, right? You took water dragon, you get a balanced Pokemon. I'm just gonna rush through this quick because we don't have a lot of time left. So if you have take two sorcerer classes, so like grass psychic, you get sorcery Pokemon. Take two combat types like fire rock, you get a combat Pokemon. You get take two types from combat and balance, right? So let's say rock dragon, you get combat balance, and then if you take two types from fire sorcery, so like rock psychic, you get combat sorcery, right? And if you count this out, you can see that there's six combinations of types that you can have, right? So this is six, right? And if you're aware of how many Pokemon you can have on your team, you can have six. So your theoretical, right, most powerful team would have one of each, right, of these classes, right? All right. If you want to understand what these classes do from a battle RPG perspective, right? So balance sorcery, balance and sorcery, right, would fall under like your flex categories. If you want to use a competitive RPG analogy, right? And then combat balance, and combat sorcery would fall under your brutalized category, right? In other words, like your main attackers, right? Right, so it gives you this flexibility to be able to, have three Pokemon that you can decide are going to be like very important attackers on your team, and then you have three slots that you can pretty much do whatever you want with, right? So it gives you a lot of flexibility with your team building. And just to kind of wrap it up, if you want to understand kind of the classification of these types, right? You have Ice Ghost would be your easy, and then your Rock Psychics would be generally more difficult. Poison Bug would be your easy. Ground Fairy would be your medium. Then Lightning Dark would be your difficult. Right? So that's the type chart. All right. So screenshot this if you want to reference it, and I hope you enjoyed that explanation. All right. So not a lot of time left, but we're gonna go and I'm gonna show you a sample team, basically using uh the type chart, right? So you can kind of understand how this team's power would work, right? So this is a sample team for um this is your sample Gen 9 team, right? Where the blueberry for the Indigo Disc, right? DLC expansion, right? And so um I just put them in the character in the same, put them in the same order as you have here. Balance sorcery, balance sorcery, combat balance, combat sorcery, right? That's the order I have here. So Metagross is your balance sorcery, right? So feels balance, and then psychic sorcery. Actress, your balance. Right? Dragon is balance. Florgus is your sorcery. Fairy is sorcery. Gamora is your uh, combat balance. No, it's your combat rather. Rock poison is combat. Landers is your combat balance, right? Ground is combat. Mine is balance. Tentacle villain is your combat sorcery, right? Uh, grass sorcery and then fire combat, right? So to sort of give a brief explanation as to kind of the roles these Pokemon are going to fit into, right? Generally, so balanced sorcery, right? We're familiar with you know, RPG classes, right? When you have like this very powerful, faction, and then you have, you know, sorcery class or the magician class, whatever that goes beside it, right? This is generally going to be your like, because it's going to set the pace for a battle, right? So that's how you should think of balanced sorcery, right? These guys are going to set the pace, right? Balanced sorcery, right? So then, balance, of course, is just going to be more of a thematic type, right? So you want to look at balance, right? It's actually going to be like a more thematic, right? Or thematic slot on your team, right? Sorcery, of course, right, is going to be a lot of, you know, it's going to be like a main control spot on your team, right? Sorcery is going to mainly be a control spot. Then combat, of course, is going to be like your main fighting type, right? Fighting slot on your team. Combat balance is going to be another like pace setter on your team, right? You have the um, faction or the balance type in to leverage the power of the Pokemon, right? Right, so it's going to be another pace setting slot similar to Balance Sorcery. And then your Combat Sorcery is going to be like your, like, going to be your Ace in the Hole, right? It's going to be the type, it's going to be the slot that's going to give you the most agency, right? So, yeah, right? This is going to be like your Ace in the Hole slot, right? So, yeah, this would just be a good sample to look at for referencing type chart and kind of understanding which slot is, right? So, yep, look at this team if you want to reference that. All right, and so that's gonna be it for episode 1 of the Exposé VGC. So thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed. And just a sneak peek of the next episode, we're gonna be covering classes, right, or roles, right? So again, right, battle RPGs, you know, roles are very important. So next episode is gonna be roles. So see you in the next.